Welcome in. I'm Austin Westfall. Let's talk about the Senate. Democrats have a very fragile majority in the Senate right now, 51 to 49. That means that Republicans can retake control with a net gain of 2 seats, or if Republicans win the presidency, all they need is a net gain of 1 seat. That's because J.D. Vance would be the tiebreaker. But then enter independent West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin. He's not running for re-election, and his seat will surely flip red. So what we're really talking about here is a 50-50 map already. Rich Rubino, one of my favorite people to talk to, he's standing by, our trusty political analyst. Rich, as always, it's good to see you. I want to talk about the Senate landscape with you and the balance of power. Where should we start? West Virginia, we know, is going to flip, but let's start off with a couple of other states that you think are the more competitive ones. Montana and Ohio come to mind.
They're very interesting because like West Virginia, Ohio, and Montana are all 3 states that Donald Trump won last time, and he won them handily. West Virginia is probably off the map, barring a cataclysm. Jim Justice, the incumbent Republican governor, very popular. Joe Manchin was probably the only Democrat who could survive in that state. So that's most likely out of the picture. So go to a state like Montana. The Democrats really have an uphill battle there. On the one hand, they have perhaps the only person who could actually win in that state, and that is Democrat Jon Tester. Tester is running for re-election. Tester's a third-generation Montanan. He's a farmer. He's somebody who very much has a Montana imprimatur on Montana kind of type values. But on the other hand, this is a state that went last time around 16 points. 16 points for Donald Trump. So it's a state that's very hard for Democrats to maintain. There have been Democrats in the past who have served there. Max Baucus, for example, was served there for 36 years. But the state, in part because there's an influx of more and more conservative voters, the state is becoming more and more Republican. Most polls are showing that Tim Sheehy is right now, who's a 38-year-old former Navy SEAL and business executive, is currently ahead by about 6 or 7 points. I think Democrats think, though, that you can never count out Jon Tester. Tester is somebody who's very much into parochial issues that affect kind of Montanans, and he's somebody who is very much he's very much somebody who's a very good retail politician, knows very many people in Montana. He might be able to pull it off, but if he does, it would really be it would be really kind of a political masterstroke and a masterstroke at retail politics. Go to the state of Ohio, and in the state of Ohio, you have Sherrod Brown, who is running for re-election. Sherrod Brown is somebody who has a very relatively liberal voting record, but he's also somebody who's very populist. He's taken on, for example, free trade. That's kind of the flagship issue, if you will, for him. He's very much was opposed to the House of Representatives toward NAFTA. He was opposed to the GATT agreement. He took on the Obama administration, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's running for re-election. He's trying to say that he will work across the aisle, that he'll work on both sides. He's actually the only constitutional officer, he's the only statewide officer, rather, in the entire Buckeye state currently who is a Democrat. The state has really gone Republican. It used to be a swing state. Bill Clinton carried it twice. Barack Obama carried it twice. But it's become more and more of a Republican state. Last time around, in fact, the last 2 times, Donald Trump, even though the Democrats invested in the state, won the state by 8 points. So Sherrod Brown and Jon Tester are really the 2 candidates that are running for re-election. The Democrats, if they're going to try to maintain this control of the United States Senate, and the chances are very slim that they actually do that, those are probably the 2 pivotal and most important races.
What's fascinating about those 2 races, too, is the incumbents in both of those races are 3-term senators. They were initially elected in 2006, I believe, and that was in an unpopular year for Republicans in light of the war. And then goes 6 years ahead of that. That was, I think, another popular year for Democrats because those were some of the Obama years. Fast forward another 6 years. And I believe you had the midterm after Trump got elected, where we saw that blue wave. So you could argue that Ohio and Montana, these red states that are going to be voting for Trump, they have their first challenger. These Democrats have their first real challenge in a long time. It will be interesting to see how Montana and Ohio play out. So there are a couple races where the Republicans may be on the defensive, and Texas and Florida come to mind. Nebraska to a degree as well. What do we know about those 3 states?
Well, Nebraska is probably the most fascinating one. So you have Deb Fischer running for re-election. This was a race. Now, this is a state, Nebraska, one of the most Republican states in the country. In fact, since Roosevelt won it in 1936, the only time in a presidential election it has gone for a Democrat is in 1964 rather, when Lyndon Johnson won in a landslide around the country and won that state. They obviously they do it by congressional district as well in Nebraska, and there's one congressional district around Omaha that is somewhat Democrat, and that's where I think Don Osborne can count on a lot of his votes. But this is interesting because Don Osborne is not a Democrat. In fact, the Democrats basically did not support anybody in their primary. They wanted to support Don Osborne for his money. Osborne basically denied it. Osborne really wants to run as an independent. In fact, he said that if he gets elected, he will not caucus with either the Republicans or the Democrats. Now, that's different than actually the four now current independent senators. They all, whether it's Kirsten Sinema, Joe Manchin, Bernie Sanders, or Angus King, they all caucus with the Democrats. Now, what does that mean? It means that when they have meetings, when they go have the Republican caucus over here, the Democratic caucus over there, they will, if they show up for it, they show up with that party. Now, is that important? Is it just pro forma? Well, no, because the parties and put the person in to appoint the person to a committee. That's why Bernie Sanders is currently the chairman of the Help Committee, for example. That's why Joe Manchin got his wish to be on the committee that involves energy, for example. So it's very important that you put somebody on a committee. Now, Dan Osborne, rather, is saying that if he gets elected, it's required under Senate rules that you have to be on two committees. So basically, the two parties would somehow have to negotiate which committees he would be on. So he could be very important if he actually gets elected. He could be essentially Joe Manchin 2.0, if you will. But this is a very interesting race. Deb Fischer should have had this in an absolute walk. This should have been a case like Massachusetts, where Elizabeth Warren, I mean, it's basically a pro forma race. There's really no chance her Republican opponent, John Deaton, will win that election simply because he's a Republican. It's a Democrat state. Very interesting. Osborne is trying to distance himself from both parties. He's a labor leader. Deb Fischer is calling him, quote unquote, a Democrat in disguise. Obviously, Democrat is a dirty word, especially as you get out toward the plains of that state. Osborne's setting up offices all over the state. He's very good at retail politicking. If he gets elected, it would be very fascinating to have somebody that is not a member of either party. The last time you had that would have been Dean Barkley, who, if you remember when Paul Wellstone died in 2002 in a plane crash, Jesse Ventura was the governor of Minnesota at the time. And he could have appointed a Democrat or a Republican. Instead, he appointed somebody who was a member of the Minnesota Reform Party, and he did not caucus with either party. So that would have been the last time that would have happened. So that's an absolutely fascinating. That's a fascinating race. Go over to Texas. Ted Cruz is somebody who was first elected actually by taking on Lieutenant Governor John Sharp, who was really the candidate of Rick Perry, the governor of Texas at the time, and the establishment of the Republican Party. Ted Cruz was really somebody who was an insurrectionist type of a candidate. And as soon as he got elected to the United States Senate, he almost immediately started running for president. Within 2 years, that's kind of the Obama precedent, right? As soon as you get elected, you start running for president. He ran in 2016, lost that election. Him and Donald Trump really had quite a tete-a-tete at the time. Donald Trump really went after Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz went after Donald Trump. But then they kind of made up. And in 2018, Ted Cruz upended Beto O'Rourke, a congressman from Texas. Now Ted Cruz is up for re-election again. He's currently running behind President Trump, who won the state by about 6.5% of the vote last time around. Colin Aldred is like Beto O'Rourke was last time, very young. He's only 41 years old. He's very charismatic. He's a former tight end for the Tennessee Titans. Should he beat Ted Cruz, I think he will immediately be thought of potentially as a presidential candidate. If Kamala Harris loses, perhaps whoever the presidential nominee in 2028, perhaps he would be somebody who would be on the short list as a potential vice presidential candidate. He could even do what Ted Cruz did and immediately start running for president. But I think that part of it is he tends to focus on local issues, Texas issues, the idea being that Ted Cruz spends more time running for president, spends more time in the national political arena, and doesn't spend enough time dealing with these kind of local parochial issues, if you will. So that's going to be really a fascinating race as well. And Florida.
Yeah, and that brings us to Florida, where Rick Scott is facing it. Yeah, and go ahead. I didn't want to cut you off.
And Rick Scott, former healthcare executive, former governor, is running for re-election. He's having really an uphill battle running for re-election. Last time around, he upended the incumbent Democrat, Senator Bill Nelson, who's now the Nassau administrator, actually. He was the past chairman of the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee. And should he win re-election, he is one of the three candidates currently running to succeed Mitch McConnell as the Republican leader, which could either be majority leader or a minority leader, respectively. He has to win his own seat first. He's having some trouble. This is a state that Donald Trump won relatively handily in 2016 and in 2020. It's a state that used to be a swing state. It's a state that Bill Clinton took in 1996. It's a state that Barack Obama won at one point. So it's a state that's becoming more and more of a Republican state. It should be relatively easy for Rick Scott to win re-election, but the polls show that it's a very close election. Debbie Purcell is running against him. She's somebody who is 14 years old, came over here from Ecuador, someone who served one term in Congress in the southern part of Miami-Dade County, but lost her re-election bid. So she decided, you got to move up, I guess, and run for senator. She's somebody that if she does win, I think she'll also be somebody that potentially she couldn't be on a national ticket because she wasn't born in the United States, but she could potentially be part of the Democratic leadership moving forward.
So there's a number of other states that we're tracking.
Debbie Powell, I'm sorry, I mispronounced the name.
Yeah, and I got to ask you about Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Some of those are more competitive than others, according to recent polls, especially Nevada and Arizona. There seems to be a little bit of distance between the candidates. But I got to ask you about Michigan, and let's talk about Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, because those are three battleground states. And ultimately, Democrats kind of have their backs against the wall, don't they? They have to win more of these races than the Republicans do. These races are more competitive for the Democrats than they are for the Republicans in large part, correct?
Yes, the Democrats almost need an inside straight, to use a card analogy, to try to main control of the United States Senate, because there are simply too many Democratic incumbent seats that are up. Now, the Michigan seat, Debbie Stabenow, who was part of the leadership, former chairman of the Agricultural Committee, she retired, and that was a seat that she had won and was reelected relatively handily. The party the party needs to maintain control. It's basically going to be a wash at the presidential level. If you look at the polls, Donald Trump is down right now by about 3 points, but depending on the poll, he can potentially be tied. So you have an election where Congressman Slotkin, who is an incumbent member of the United States House of Representatives, somebody who came from a district that was very much of a swing district, so she knows how to get elected. She knows how to get elected in a rural part of the state. She's running she's running for the Democratic nomination. Mike Rogers, a former chairman of the Intelligence Committee, a former member of Congress from Michigan, former CNN commentator, is challenging her for that Senate seat. It's going to be very important. Michigan is the state that the Democrats absolutely need to maintain control of the United States Senate. The other one is Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin. Tammy Baldwin would be running for a third term. She's somebody that actually there was some thought that potentially when Joe Biden said in 2020 with his debate with Bernie Sanders that his vice presidential nominee would be a woman, a lot of people immediately said, well, there's this popular swing state senator named Tammy Baldwin who potentially could could purloin Wisconsin and bring it over to the Democratic column. It went to the Republican column last time. Now she's in the political fight of her life in really a swing state. I think if one candidate, if Kamala Harris or if Donald Trump were to win by a couple points, they might be able to bring coattails and bring her over by a point or two. But that's a very, very close election.
Before we talk about Pennsylvania, I want to play out this piece from Fox's Madeline Rivera. Let's watch this and talk about it on the other side.
Okay.
Republicans are feeling bullish about their chances of retaking the Senate. A lot of races which were tight to begin with are getting even tighter as we get closer to Election Day, and that is exactly the case in Pennsylvania. A New York Times Siena College poll shows the Democratic incumbent Senator Bob Casey leading Republican businessman David McCormick 48 to 44%. In September, Casey topped McCormick 49 to 40%. Casey now ramping up efforts to appeal to the center. He's out with a new ad which references a moment where he sided with former President Trump.
Casey bucked Biden to protect fracking, and he sided with Trump to end NAFTA and put tariffs on China to stop them from cheating.
On Tuesday, Casey and McCormick faced off in their second and final debate. The two sparred over abortion, inflation, energy, and the border. Casey casting McCormick as out of touch. McCormick, meantime, slamming Casey as a do-nothing career politician.
I want to go after price gouging. My opponent won't do it. He doesn't think we should do anything about price gouging. In fact, he excuses big corporations ripping off families. I think we should hold them accountable.
I'm someone who will get things done. Senator Casey, in 18 years in the Senate, 30 years in elected office, does not have a record he can run on, which is why he's devoted himself to attacking me.
The contest in Pennsylvania is one of the most expensive Senate races in the country. Casey reported raising more than $40 million through the end of last month, double of what his opponent raised. But a flood of money from super PACs is boosting McCormick, which has helped close the gap in finances and polling. In Washington, Mather Rivera, Fox News.
So, Rich, I find that to be an interesting dynamic, not only in the Pennsylvania race, but also in the Maryland race. We're seeing some of these high-profile candidates actually taking positions against what their party would typically use as rhetoric, correct?
Yes, and that's really been the case from time immemorial. If you represent a state that is very Democrat and you're a Republican, in order to get reelected or reelected, you have to show that you're distance yourself from your party. You're seeing that in Massachusetts. John Deaton, the Republican senatorial nominee, talks about how, for example, he is in favor of Roe v. Wade and he's in favor of codifying abortion rights into the United States Constitution. He's saying he will not demonize alien migrants, for example. So he's trying to distance himself from the National Party because the National Party is so unpopular. Larry Hogan, the exact same thing in the state of Maryland. I remember Allison Lenderson Grimes was running in 2014 against Mitch McConnell in the state of Kentucky. And at the time, the Clintons, Bill and Hillary Clinton, were very popular in Kentucky. So they asked her if she supported Barack Obama, and she would immediately say no. She said, I'm a Clinton Democrat, meaning that she supported Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. She did not support necessarily Barack Obama. They asked her who she actually voted for and who she was going to vote for. And she said, well, one thing about America is we have the secret ballot, so I won't tell anyone how I voted. That landed up having deleterious effects on her because it made her seen as kind of somebody who's wishy-washy. Gene Taylor in 2010, he was a congressman from South Mississippi. He was running for re-election, and he actually, at the last debate he had that year, he actually said that, and this is a Democrat, that he voted for John McCain in the 2008 presidential election. So it's very common. Maryland is very much an interesting race because this is a state that won about 33 points last time for Donald Trump. But Larry Hogan was a two-term governor, and he was a very popular two-term governor. In fact, very interesting dynamic here. The last year of their terms, Charlie Baker and Larry Hogan, as well as Phil Scott, the Republican governor of Vermont, all three Republican governors were respectively the most popular governors in the entire country, and they represented, just in a litany here, the three best states for Joe Biden in 2020. Now, why is that? Well, because when you run for governor, it's actually in a blue state, or if you run as a Republican in a blue state, or you run as a Democrat in a red state, it's actually pretty easy to get elected because all you have to do is say, look, the other party, they're going to have hegemony over both houses of the legislature. All I'm going to do is be a check, and I'm going to be a moderate. So as a result, in 1990, Senator Ben Nelson got elected in Ruby Red, Republican Nebraska. Bill Weld gets elected to the United States to the governorship of Massachusetts in very much a Democratic state. So in 1994, Ben Nelson in very Republican Nebraska gets reelected. Bill Weld gets reelected in Massachusetts. In 1996, they both said, well, we're very popular in our home states. Let's run for Senate. So Ben Nelson runs, and his opponent, Republican Chuck Hagel, does everything he possibly can to try to allegate Senator Nelson to the National Party. And the first vote Nelson is going to have is going to be Senate Majority Leader or Senate Minority Leader. And that means he's going to have to vote for somebody from the National Party. So Ben Nelson, even though he's popular, loses that bid. Bill Weld over in Massachusetts loses to John Kerry, even though he's a job approval rating of 70% and just was reelected with 71%, the biggest margin of any governor up to that time of Massachusetts. He loses that bid for United States Senate because he could not disinhibit himself from the National Republican Party. He was immediately linked to Newt Gingrich, the Speaker of the House in the House of Representatives, linked to Senator Dole, linked to Senator Trent Lott, and he just could not distance himself. So that's why it would be very hard for Larry Hogan to pull this out.
So I got to ask you, let's just take a wide look at everything that we're kind of talking about with these races. The Democrats, as I said, their back is against the wall. Is it seeming like we're going to have a Republican-controlled Senate come next year?
Yeah, I would say the odds are that there will be a Republican-controlled United States Senate, which and there's a very strong possibility that Vice President Harris could get elected and have a Republican-controlled United States Senate, meaning that in order for her to get her legislation, including her economic package, through the United States Congress, she's going to need to have some Republican votes to do that. Now, the other thing is the Republicans, if they controlled it, they have what's called the filibuster, meaning essentially that it really takes 60 votes to get something through the United States Senate, not 50. That's why Barack Obama had to get 60 votes to get his health care plan through the United States Senate back in 2010, 2009, rather than 50 votes. Of course, if the Democrats were control the United States Senate, they could use the nuclear option and try to eliminate the filibuster, but that's going to make it very hard. And it's just going to make it very hard generally for her to try to govern as a partisan figure. She's going to have to do a lot of what Bill Clinton did in 1995 and 1996 with welfare reform and Kennedy Kassebaum raising the minimum wage. She's going to have to reach across the aisle if she wants to have a consequential presidency.
All right. The big night is approaching us, Rich. We'll talk with you soon.
Yes, it is. Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
You bet. All right. Let's slide away for a quick break. We're back in 2 minutes.